Now I will be going through how to read and understand and use API documentations. An API documentation is a page that describes how to use and integrate the API of an application into your code. And so this documentation typically contains information on how to structure requests. So things like the necessary request headers, the request URL, the methods, and the body data types. And so, for example, this is an example of a documentation page, which is the enricher documentation page. Here we see that it for each of the operations, it would describe what action you'd like to perform, like analyze a gene set, and then give you information about how to perform this API request. The part of the enricher documentation that describes how to make an API request to analyze a gene set is shown on the right. And so we see here that they've said, so to analyze a gene set, they've given us the method that we would use to do this, the URL endpoint, which is enrich/add-list. It'll also tell you what parameters you would need to send in with this request in order to get the response that you want. So here we see that we would need to send the gene list that we are trying to analyze, and also you could also send an optional description, which is just a string that describing what these gene symbols are. Some API documentations, like we see here, would also give you an example code. And so this would make it very easy for you to see how to implement this exact same API to implement this exact same API request into your own Python code. For each of most API documentations for each of the requests would also give you a format of what the response would be. So here we see the example results would be containing the ID of the unique ID of this added gene set, which you can then use to get the enrichment analysis results. So here on the right, we see that they've also highlighted this how to perform the API request to get these enrichment analysis results. So here we see that after specifying the enricher URL, we would be sending the unique ID of that added gene set, which is the user list ID here that we got earlier. We would be adding that as a query parameter, and it's also specifying what gene set library we would like to enrich against. I will also go through more in depth on how to understand each of these packages, such as the JSON package that is used to kind of parse these responses. Other than on their web pages, the API documentation of some bioinformatics tools can also be found in Smart API. And so Smart API is a registry where API documentations are deposited according to Open API specifications, with additional metadata in order to maximize fairness, which is basically the findability, accessibility, and interoperability and reuse of these digital assets. So in the Smart API site, which is linked here, we can search for API documentations that have been deposited in this repository using the search bar. So here I've searched for an enricher. And for each of the found API documentations, we can view these and also look at the various endpoints which are available for each of these APIs. One of the things that Smart API is very useful for is similar to the PostgreSQL IDE. It's useful for constructing and testing REST API queries. And so this is the enricher API in the Smart API registry. On first glance, the page would show all the available endpoints that can be used to make a request and also give a brief description of the functionality. For each endpoint, we can then test on the query with data. So selecting the term map endpoint, we see that the term map endpoint would return gene sets from enricher whose terms contain the query string. And after selecting that option, we can then click on the try it out button, which will allow you to specify parameters. After clicking on here, it will tell you what parameters are required and fill in a description of what these parameters are. So for example, using the term cancer as the parameter for the term up endpoint would display after clicking on after executing this example, it would display the full request URL, which was used to make this request, and also what the output would look like for each status code. So if this was successful, we would be able to get all the gene set terms that contain the term cancer from each gene set library in Enricher. Another important tool that can be used to understand API requests is the browser network panel. And so the network panel can be used to see what resources are being uploaded and downloaded. It can also be used to inspect the properties of a resource that was sent back by a server. So for example, the HTTP headers, the content, and the size of this resource, for example, like an image. We could also use this panel to inspect what requests and resources are being sent and retrieved by a specific web page. So in order to access the web page in order to access the web page network panel, you can right-click on a specific web page and then click on the inspect option and then on developer tools. After clicking there, you can then navigate to the network panel, which I've highlighted here. And this is kind of what this would look like when no requests are being sent by that specific web page. So if there were requests being sent, this would have more colors and lines in it. So like I said earlier, we can investigate what requests are made by a web page in this panel. And so, for example, we can look at what requests are made when a gene set is entered into Enricher for an enrichment analysis. After pasting the gene symbols and clicking on the submit button, we will see that many API requests are then made to retrieve the enrichment analysis results based on the different gene set libraries. So we can walk through kind of So let's walk through looking at the requests made using the enrich endpoint for the Kia 2022 library. So after clicking on this specific request, we can then look at the headers, payload, preview, response initiator, and timing of that particular request. In the headers tab, we're able to find the request URL, which you can see here. We're also able to see what the request method was for that API request, which was get. We also see what the status of that request was, and so it's green, which means it's green and saying 200 OK, which means that it was successful. On the same page, we're also able to on the same page, we're also able to see the response headers, which we can see over here, the response headers and the request headers, which can contain things such as the access control origin, the access control allow credentials and headers, and etc. The payload panel shows the data that you're interested in sending to the server when you make an API request. And so this could either be the query parameters or the body of the request that was sent during an API call. So for example, here we see that for that particular enrich request, the query string parameters that were sent, like we saw earlier in the documentation, it would be the user list ID, which is the unique ID of the user gene set, and also the background type. And so we wanted to look at the Kia 2022 library, and that's specified here as well. We also see that the preview and the response panels would display the content of the response body or the information that was sent back in response to a request. And so here, after clicking on these two panels, we see that we see the initial analysis results for our input gene set using the KIA 2022 library. And so here it's sent back in the format of the library or the background that we requested, which is the key and the value being a list of lists, where each list basically has the rank, the term name, p-value, odds ratio, combined score, overlapping genes, adjusted p-value, old p-value, and old adjusted p-value, which was the return structure which we saw highlighted in the API documentation as well. You could also use the timing panel in order to see a detailed description of the requests arrival and load times. Now that we've gone through understanding what API requests and responses are, and we've also figured out how to make these API calls, let's see how we can integrate this into our workflows using code. And so when using Python, there are two important libraries for using APIs. So we have the request and the JSON libraries. The request library is an HTTP library that enables sending HTTP requests in code. So for example, this is how we would make a GET request using the request library. You would just put the request URL as an input into the request.get function. And so here, this is our request URL, and we just put that as the input parameter to request.get. The JSON library, on the other hand, is important for sending data in requests and parsing the response of our requests. And so two important functions of this library are the JSON.dumps, which takes in a Python object and converts it into a string. And this is very important for when we're trying to send data when making a request. And so we would get our Python object that we'd like to send, so like a string or a dictionary, and we just put it as the input into JSON.dumps. The other function is JSON.loads, which does the opposite, which takes a JSON string, which is usually what is returned by on the API in the response, and then this converts or basically loads it, like its name implies, into a Python object, like a list or a dictionary. Another thing, important thing to note is the use of API keys. And so an API key is a unique string of characters that an API provider gives a developer in order to authorize their access to their API. So for example, this is useful when the API provider is trying to track costs. So for example, when using something like ChatGPT, that costs money, they would every account would have an API key, which they would then be able to use, which they would then be able to use to authorize the requests that are being sent to the API. And so API requests are usually sent in the header of the client requests, like we see in this diagram here, or as a query parameter in order to identify the client to the server. So we can see that here, that after the endpoint, where it's like, for example, this depends on how the API documentation asks you as the client to structure this URL. But you could also, but in most cases, you just add it as like an API key, a parameter into your URL. So one thing that's important to note is that you should keep your API keys private. And so do not put your API key in the code that you're depositing into online repositories, such as GitHub. And a solution to this is to always store your API keys in a .env or environment file. And that is only kept locally. So when you're pushing this code to GitHub, you will specify that the .env file is to be kept in your git ignore. Is kept in git ignore. So when you're pushing this code to GitHub, this file is ignored, and so your API keys are then kept safe locally. When an API request requires an API key for authentication, so basically when you need the API key to tell the server that the user is allowed to make the request, a 401 or unauthorized response status is returned if this request was sent without this API key specified, or if an invalid API key was sent with the request. So alternatively, if you're trying to write JavaScript code, the fetch API is used to programmatically make API calls. And so the fetch API is a promise-based method that provides an easy and logical way to fetch resources asynchronously across the network. And so, for example, to make a get request in JavaScript using fetch, you simply use await fetch, and then you're able to get the actual response by doing .json. Because fetch is asynchronous, to get the output of the request, you would always have to use either await, or you're trying not to make this an async function, you could just use fetch and then put .then to extract the response of the request that way. And so using the fetch API, you can also specify the method, the mode, credentials, and the request headers as the second parameter into the fetch function. You can also find more about the fetch API at the MDM docs at a specific link, which I've also linked in the slides. Another similar promise-based library used for making API requests in JavaScript is the Axios library. And so this can be downloaded into your project by running the npm install Axios command in your terminal. And this works similarly to fetch. And for example, for making a post request using this library, you would put in the axios.post, which takes in 3 parameters: the request URL or endpoint, then the data that you're trying to send, and then you could also then specify the config parameters, which is where you specify the headers, which you can see here. So here we have the URL, then we put in our data, and then this is the config parameters, which is just in a JSON format where we have each of the specific part of the specific config parameter, like the headers specified here, which we're mapping to its value. And so one thing to note is that here the data is in an object format and not in a string, like in fetch, which means that it has key value pairs, which are defined by the schema that the server accepts. And this schema is easily found in this API's documentation.